Alright guys, so the next page that we're going to be doing, this is tonight's homework, so it's going to be 2.5. You might end up doing it for 2.6 as well. The title for this is just factoring quadratics. So let's just quickly review. A quadratic is something that has a squared term. Alright, it might be an x, it might be something else. Mine's going to be on page 3. Take a minute to get yours set up. And then go ahead and turn to the page. So, factoring quadratics. So our objective is I can factor a quadratic using the grouping method. There are several methods that you can use to try and learn how to factor quadratics, but today we're only going to focus on the grouping method because it is the most reliable. So we're going to do 3 examples, and throughout that I'll be walking you through the steps that you need to do them. I may not write down the steps, so if you catch something that I say is an important step, you should pause the video and write it down. Alright, so example number 1. Let's say we have 12x squared plus 34x plus 10. Our first step that we want to make sure we do is to factor out a GCF. That's why we did that the other day. So first thing is to look for a GCF. I do see a common factor, not a variable but a number. So I'm going to pull out the 2, and this is going to become 2 times 6, x squared would give us 12x, plus 2 times 17x will give us 34x, and then plus 5. So this GCF is just kind of, it's going to stay with us through the rest of the problem until we are done. Now, in order to do the grouping, we have to multiply this first term and this last term. So 6 times 5, positive 6 times positive 5 gives me 30. So I now need to list the factors that multiply to give us 30. And what I want to do is see if when I add them, they give us 17. So 1 and 30 added up equals 31. We could do negative 1 and negative 30 because a negative times a negative is positive. But that would give me a negative 31, and I don't need a negative. So 2 and 15, if we add those up, hey look, that gives us 17. So we're going to go with that. We could go ahead and check 3 and 10. If we add those up, we get 13. But I want to go with this one because I've got a 17 here. So now what we're going to do is rewrite this 17x as 2x plus 15x, because when we add them and combine like terms, we get 17x. So my GCF stays out front. I'm just going to take up a little bit more space, 6x squared. It doesn't matter which order I write these in, so if you have a 15 over here, that's fine. Alright, so now here's the tricky part. We're going to group together the first 2 terms and the second 2 terms. And we're going to pull out the GCF of each one. So I'm going to start with this 2 stays outside. What is the GCF of just these 2? Alright, well that's going to be a 2x. And what's left over, 2x times what gives me 6x squared? That's going to be 3x. And 2x times what gives me 2x? Well, that's 1. Now, what's the GCF of these? It's a positive 5, so I'm going to write plus 5. And I'm going to write, when I factor out my GCF, what would remain inside the parentheses? 5 times 3x would give me 15x, and 5 times 1 gives me 5. Now, here's the awesome part. I'm going to start with the 2 here. Do you see anything repeated in this expression? You should see the 3x plus 1 repeated. So I'm going to start by writing that one first. So 3x plus 1. And then what's left are the coefficients. 2x plus 5. So this right here is my most factored form. Now this is the most complicated example we're going to do. All right, we're going to move on to another example now. All right, so we're going to do x squared minus 144. All right, so real quickly, I just want to go over the fact that we have usually 3 terms, okay? Our 3 terms are x squared is called our quadratic term. The variable with the x is called our linear term, because when we have linear lines, we only have an exponent of 1. And the number is called our constant. In this expression right here, we have our quadratic. I don't see a linear term, and I see a negative 144 as our constant. All right? So what we need to do is we need a linear term in here. So if I add something to this, I need to think, well, if I add something to it that doesn't change the value, what am I adding? It's going to be a plus 0x, because 0 times anything is 0, and minus 144. So now I can repeat my process of multiplying this first number, which is a 1, times this last number, which is a negative. So 1 times negative 144 is negative 144. So now I'm going to do a t-chart of my factors, and I want 2 numbers that when I multiply them give me 144, and when I add them they give me 0. Now here's where our number skills come into play. This number is negative, so one of these has to be negative. So I'm going to start with positive 1 and negative 144. If I add them up, I do not get 0. What about 2 and 72? If I add those up, if one of them's negative, we'll make the 2 negative this time. We don't get 0. So I need 2 numbers, just like when we did elimination with systems, that when I add them, they're opposites. So let's try it. Positive 12 and negative 12. If I add those together, I do get 0. So I'm going to take these 2 and write them as that middle term. So we have x squared plus 12x minus 12x. If I combine those, I would go back to 0. And then minus 144. So I'm taking this and I'm expanding it. So this becomes both of these, right? Now I'm going to do my grouping. So the first 2, our GCF is just an x. I'm left with x plus 12. My second 2, see how this one has a negative? I always want to factor out that negative. So my GCF here is negative 12. And then x, and the negative 12 times positive 12 would give me negative 144. Oop, this is supposed to be in pink. So now we're going to take x plus 12 is repeated. And then x minus 12, these 2 form its own parentheses. So this is my factored form. All right, our last example. We have x squared minus x minus 20. So we have all three terms, our quadratic, our linear, and our constant. So we don't need to insert a 0 anywhere. So we can just start by multiplying our first and our last. So first is a 1. So 1 times negative 20 is negative 20. I need to think of two numbers that when I multiply them together, I get negative 20. And when I add them together, I get a negative 1. So let's go with, since this is negative, I'm going to make the bigger number negative. So 1 and negative 20, if I add those up, I get negative 19. 2 and negative 10, I get negative 8. I'm getting closer. 3 doesn't go into 20. 4 and negative 5, if I add those up, hey, I get negative 1. So we are going to use these two numbers. So we have x squared. I'm going to go with plus 4x. And then minus 5x. If I combine these two, I should get negative 1x minus 20. All right, so let's do our grouping. The first one, our GCF is just an x. We're left with x plus 4. Our second one, our GCF, because it has that negative again, is going to be negative 5. And then we're left with x plus 4, because negative 5 times positive 4 is negative 20. This is repeated, so I'm going to write that first. I'm going to take the coefficients of those of those parentheses and write them here. So we have x minus 5. This is my factored form of that quadratic. Couple things to keep in mind. If you don't see parentheses that are the exact same, like a group that we can bring out front, then you might want to go back and check your work. Also, when you're multiplying, you need to always remember to multiply that coefficient of the quadratic times our constant term. That goes over here, and that's what we can think of our factors. So we want numbers that multiply to give us that number and add to give us our linear coefficient.